Welcome to Season 6, Episode 1 of Fire Away, Rudner Law's online show focused on the employment law issues that matter to you. My name is Stuart Rudner. I'm an employment lawyer and mediator, the founder of Rudner Law, and your host of this episode of Fire Away. Just a reminder, Fire Away streams live online every month, so if you missed an episode or if you want to watch one again, they're always available on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe, our Facebook page, and on our website. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by Carlos Cadogan and Shawnee for a conversation about conflict in the modern workplace, whether it be microaggression, offensive jokes, harassment claims, or anything along those lines, and what we can do not only to navigate this kind of toxicity, but also to make positive change away from toxicity in the workplace. I'm very excited about the discussion. So first of all, Carlos and Shawnee, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So before we get into the topic of harassment in the workplace and toxicity and all that, why don't each of you take a moment just to introduce yourselves and what you do? So Shawnee, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thanks. So I am an HR practitioner. I've been doing this for more than 30 years now, dating myself. I work actually in the Kelowna area, so in the Okanagan, which is not so sunny today, but usually it would be. And when I say an HR practitioner, I've worked primarily with entrepreneurial and growing businesses, changing, I should say, because sometimes entrepreneurial businesses aren't always growing. And I always talk about the big five. We do a lot of recruiting and onboarding, compensation and benefits, training and development, performance management, and then culture wraps around it all, which is part of the reason I'm here today. Thanks for having me again.
Awesome. Thank you. And Carlos?
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me again. My name is Carlos Cadogan. Like you said, I'm here calling from Toronto, Ontario. And what I do is I'm an inclusion enthusiast. What does that mean? I work with organizations and communities to help develop their individuals, the participants, their leaders on the skill sets to help navigate the things that we're talking about today, which is how to effectively work and collaborate with people who don't look like us or work like us. And so, I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to have both of you guys. And I have to say, part of the motivation for the topic is a group that Carlos and I are both a part of, which I think I may have missed this morning, actually. But it's a group that gets together once a month and talks about some of the equity, diversity, and inclusivity issues and things like cancel culture and all that. And we've had some great discussions. So that kind of prompted this discussion because obviously practicing employment law, a lot of what we deal with at Rudner Law is harassment or allegations of harassment. Sometimes it's not actually harassment. Sometimes it's just someone with a thin skin, or sometimes it's just a manager who doesn't really have that the right approach or the understanding of civility in the workplace. Or sometimes we're talking about bullying or harassment or sexual harassment. And sometimes it's things like inappropriate jokes and things that may have been acceptable 10 or 15 or maybe even 5 years ago, but aren't acceptable now, and how you deal with it. So that's really one of the first things I wanted to talk about, which is, now that we're into 2023, how do you handle that proverbial class clown who always makes jokes and sometimes takes them either close to the line or over the line? And what do you do about that in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, I'll take that one, Stuart. It's a long one, but I think the first thing you have to do is, as an organization, is kind of back up, right? Most of our organizations have some sort of tenets or values that we hold true into the way that we deal with each other as colleagues at the workplace or with our customers. And so, maybe this class clown is not trying to be offensive. Maybe, they're a good person, but is the way they're behaving actually go back to the values that the organization set forth? And so that's the first thing I would do, is stress it from that perspective. And then once you decide, and I think most organizations do have sort of tenets or values, well, how does that actually show up in our organization? So what I mean by that is you could have all these tenets and values on your website, and as a leadership group, you could recite them, but do they actually walk the talk? Right. And then as you go through the organization, whether it's middle management down to individual contributors, do they feel those values down where they work? So most organizations, when they hire for culture fit, actually don't even really know what their cultures are. And I would ask them to be more self-aware, ask and kind of investigate. And from there, reinforce those tenets and then address those individuals who might be the class clown. It doesn't mean any harm, but go back to, hey, we don't need to cancel him, but go back to those values and tenets and say, hey, remember the value, the respect, whatever those tenets are, we got to uphold those. And that joke might be okay for you, maybe okay for that one person, but there's someone here that's probably going to be offended by that joke. And so let's use those values and tenets to kind of move away from that kind of behavior.
Thanks, Carlos. That's really helpful. And Shawnee, I don't know if you had anything to add on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I can jump in too, actually. So
Please.
I totally agree with what Carlos is saying. And I think the build I would have is that, I often try and talk to leaders and managers about telling their teams that, this is a whole point of being in a workplace is being inclusive to all. And so if you can see somebody isn't enjoying a conversation, you can, be self-aware enough to find a new topic or to engage with them on what, the discomfort is. And I guess the other thing I look at, and maybe this is just me counseling patience and grace, but, we all come into any relationship, but certainly a workplace relationship with lots of experience that we bring to the table. Some call it baggage, but I like to call it experience. And when you come into that, your sort of knowledge and understanding of how things happen can be influenced from factors outside. And so, you enter a new relationship, even if you enter an organization that has got a culture established, part of the job of each side of that relationship is to learn a little bit more about what people mean and how they're feeling and where they come from. And sometimes I find, just that counsel of, hey, spend some time figuring this out, talking to them, learning more. Once you get a better understanding, sometimes those words that were really hot buttons for you become less so because you understand the person. That doesn't mean that, I'm giving people a free ride who say I didn't mean it, but it just, I think there's a responsibility on both sides to, really spend some time trying to understand the person that's saying or doing the behavior.
Well, thanks, Sean. I think that's really helpful. And I think especially when you're dealing with someone who is, older, in other words, has been in the workplace for a while, they may have, grown up where the norms were very, very different. And I'm sure you guys have seen this because I've seen a lot where someone says, we've always joked that way. We've always talked that way. So why are things changing? And then, you get people who are sort of anti-political correctness and they think that, everything's been, there's no more fun allowed for that as well. So how do you, when you get that kind of response, how do you address that, and how do you explain to the person why what might have been acceptable in the past is not acceptable now?
Yeah, I just think you talk about the realities of the worlds we live in now. You go back 30, 40 years, I'm a Gen Xer. My expectation at working for someone was to get paid every 2 weeks, right? That was pretty much my expectation. If I got an amazing boss leader out of it, it was a bonus. You fast forward now, and because of the technology interventions, the way we expect employees to work as a team, often organizations say we're a family. Well, families have disagreements. Families have the weird uncle over there, or the weird, we have these differences. And what we're doing is we set these values, like we talked about earlier. We expect them to be more of a family, but then we don't give them the skills beyond the technical skills to actually work with each other effectively. And the way to do that, to what you're talking about, is we often refer back to people's cultural differences, right? What age group you're from, how old you are, obviously, your skin tone, the way you maybe pray, how you dress. But those things are important starting points. But what's more important is the actual cultural values that differ from those differences. And what I mean by that is cultural values are the way that we like to collaborate, work, and form relationships. So depending what generation you're from, where you're from in the country, what culture you came from when you came to this organization, the way you work with people is different. So you got to give people the skills to be able to notice their own cultural values and others' cultural values. Because we meet someone, we often imprint our cultural values on the next person. So if Stuart comes over to me and shakes my hand and doesn't look me in the eye, I might think Stuart's not being respectful. But depending on my relationship with Stuart, where Stuart's from, looking me in the eye is a sign of respect, or it could be like I'm trying to intimidate Carlos. And so we often do that. So we have to do those things to really say, yes, here's our differences, but let's dig a little deeper and talk about what are the different values here, whether it's from baby boomer to Gen Xer or from a guy working from the East Coast versus someone on the West Coast. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and especially the eye contact thing, which we're not. I don't think we'll have time to get into this, but even hiring. I've had this discussion before about how do you gauge someone or assess their credibility is another issue, but even just personality. And sometimes they'll say, well, they didn't look me in the eye, but as you said, sometimes some cultures it's actually disrespectful to look someone in the eye, especially if they're someone who is perceived as a superior. So yeah, you got to take all that into account. And I was going to follow up on one thing, and maybe Shawnee, I don't know if you wanted to address this. One of you, and Shawnee, I think it was you, talked about, if you notice that someone's uncomfortable, in the context of the jokes. What about if you don't notice it because no one is outwardly uncomfortable, but nevertheless the comments that were made are still inappropriate? How do you deal with that?
So one of the things I go back to is consensual banter, the dialogue between friends that happens outside of work, especially if you become quote unquote that family or that team or whatever that is really bonded, often do come back into the workplace. And that's a cultural question that, to be honest, I try and tread carefully with. If everybody's enjoying it and it isn't breaking any laws and not unethical, then the specific jokes, I guess I don't want to be going in and setting policy around what's appropriate or inappropriate other than what general society is aware of being appropriate. But yeah, when you talk about, the idea that somebody's, well, this is the way we are here, so first of all, I would say I work a lot with small business. If that's the way your small business is, be careful not to bring somebody in who's not going to be able to work effectively in that environment. If they're going to be upset about it or uncomfortable, you either have to work on the culture right away before they come in, or you have to be prepared to deal with some real difficult times conflict wise in the onboarding process. And I guess the other part of that is, we, unless you haven't had social media or any communication for the last 10 years, I think people saying, oh, this is the way it's always been, or this is just the way I am, it's kind of old news, right? Like you just can't anymore. And it was interesting, Carlos, if I could just build on something you said about the coming from different generations and what our expectations are. I mean, in some ways, I wish I had the expectations of a Gen Zer or a Gen Yer back, when I started. I might have asked for more, so give them credit for speaking up. And I also think a lot of us oldies can sort of, we're learning how to do new things every day. I'm using Zoom, so obviously I could potentially learn how to choose my words more carefully. And I guess just coming back to where we started, or where I started with this, is if you're in a group and everybody is comfortable with what's being said, that's one thing for that very small group, as long as no one else in the workplace can see you or hear you. But if you're in a place where you can be seen or heard, you do have to have a lens of what's acceptable in the world, in the society. And organizationally, as a boss, I'm not going to go in and say, hey, don't say that anymore if it's just between the two of you. But I always have a lens on, what's fair, what's inclusive, what's respectful, and those norms have changed. And I think we have to, as individuals, own up to that, as well as companies and bosses.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair point. The only thing I would add to that, because I've seen situations that arise where everyone in the room looks like they're the same, right? They all look at their white, they all assume they're all heterosexual, but maybe more of them are not all the same religion or the same sexual orientation. And so people are making jokes assuming that it's not offensive to any of them, but of course it is offensive to one. So, I mean, as you said, if you haven't been on social media, or basically if you've been under a rock for the last 10 years, you may not appreciate that. Otherwise, hopefully people will, but sometimes they've got to be reminded.
Well, one more quick thing. That was something I meant to say earlier to what Carlos was saying. One of the biggest gaps I see in organizations is we aren't teaching people how to respectfully communicate when they're not feeling comfortable, and we don't make it a safe place to do so. And so I really think it's incumbent upon employers, all employers, no matter how big or how small, to talk about how these issues can be raised and how we can have successful, dialogue around them, actually, because I actually think I don't understand and want to dive into the school system or the social norms and social system, but we don't teach people how to argue very well anymore. We don't teach people how to speak up, right? We don't tell them how to get their issues resolved. And as a person who does workplace investigations, one of the parts that always leaves me feeling the saddest in an investigation is how the people who were witnesses and who, feel like bystanders feel afterwards, because they didn't feel like they were able to speak up or do anything.
Yeah, and I'm sure you guys have seen this too. Like I have seen situations where, it's this classic situation of a whole group of people joking around. There's a couple of comments that are inappropriate that, may or may not have bothered some people. But you often you talk to the bystanders, and a lot of them they feel horrible later. And they often, and I've seen it as well, where they'll go and apologize to the person, like the quote unquote victim, later, but they don't say anything in the moment. Yeah. And I guess that's what I was going to come to, because I think I wanted to come to sort of prevention, but also talk about, you raise a great point. Like, how should people respond? If they are the person who feels as though they are being targeted intentionally or unintentionally, but also just for everyone else. Like, how should people be responding when the class clown does make that inappropriate joke?
Yeah, good point. I mean, a couple of things. One, everyone might make the joke and they think it's okay because no one's upset that we're talking about, but that's where the organization needs to always do a pulse check on their culture and do things like surveys where people can give honest feedback that are like simple answers, not where you have to write down a paragraph or text, because then maybe they can sneakily find out who wrote it. But if they start to hear these things back, then they understand that this is actually a problem, because to your point, someone might not feel comfortable speaking up. In order to have that person feel comfortable speaking up, again, it goes back to everything else, I think, in life, which is around education and training. And I'm not saying technical skills are not important. Of course they are. But as we know, the more senior you get in an organization, what we're talking about now is how you inspire people and how you coach people. It's not so much how good you are with Excel. And so we just skip that piece. We just say, hey, Stuart's amazing. You're going to be this guy. And then keep everything the same. What we have to do is train him to understand and give people the skills to be able to manage and have conflict in a way that doesn't raise the temperature in the room. And that's what we're talking about really here is it's microaggressions. And right, these aren't blatant racist or sexist comments. Potentially, it's like these little slights that people give to someone as a joke. And what we need is more people to give microaffirmations. An example could be Shawnee's talking in a presentation and a couple of guys are laughing in the back. I, as Carlos, should be able to say to those guys, hey, I know that we could talk later. I know that's a funny thing you want to discuss, but let's hear Shawnee out. Like, those are things that are not going to, instantly result into a brawl, right? But it's a way to kind of show Shawnee that I support her and that these guys realize, okay, well, she's probably got an ally here. Maybe we should check ourselves. Those are little things that we need to do and teach people how to do that instead of just, again, just thinking it's, everything's going to be fine. We don't want to get too much involved. I think that's fine, but we also have to give people skill sets that if you are in that room and you do feel like, this isn't good for me or isn't good for the next person, how do I address it? Because I think that's the problem. People want to address it. That's not going to exclude them or create more of an issue, right? And so how do I do that? And I think microaffirmations are these subtle ways where we can show support of each other is a way we can do something like that.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. Sorry, Shawnee, do you want to add something?
Well, I was going to say, I completely agree. And I realize, what I said earlier could be taken out of context. I think that as a boss or as a leader in an organization, it is up to us to model and to speak up when we see things that are going offside. That doesn't mean I want to completely, stifle the sense of camaraderie and the laughter. But to Carlos's point, we need to be in a position to model the kinds of behaviors that we expect and to, put a stop and or check in with people after something has been said or done to make sure that they do feel that, it was consensual and that they are happy with it and feel good about it.
Yeah, makes sense. So I was going to come back. I think Carlos early in the discussion, he said something about, we don't want to cancel him or her. Mm-hmm. When do you, let's say we go through this scenario where there is a complaint or a concern, you talk to them, you try to explain why what they did was inappropriate. At what point do you, and I can talk about this from a legal perspective, but
Sure.
from more of an HR perspective, at what point do you give up and say, you know what, like this relationship is just not going to work?
Yeah, I'm not an HR professional. I don't know what that line is, but I would say, me personally, I think canceling, to your point earlier, I think, Shawnee, is we don't teach people how to communicate anymore or to debate. We just shout at each other from our entrenched sides of the field. And so I'm opposed to canceling most people, even if I completely disagree with them. What I want to try to do is zoom out and try to give them different perspectives and help them be more self-aware and empathetic and curious about other people. Have a little bit more humility on their side, and by me giving them some of my humility. And I think that's what's missing. I think when you have to finally draw the line is clearly when someone crosses policies, when someone doesn't seem to have interest or care to how this might impact other people. Then as an organization, you go back to your tenets and your values and your culture. Is this person a culture fit? Right? Like I use our own language to define what we're doing here, because if everything this person is doing is the antithesis of what is on our website and what we preach as values in our town hall, great, he's a class clown, everyone loves him, but why is this person he or she or they are, why are they here? And so that's where the organization's got to decide, is this really the fit? And so again, it goes back to the top of the call is, what's our culture? What is it now? What do we want it to be? And do these people fall in line with that? And if not, then we got to find someone who does.
I like the way you brought that back to what you said before, but going back to the basic tenets of the organization, which I think is really where everything should start. So I think that's a really good point. Shawnee, do you want to add to that?
I agree. Actually, I think it's wonderful the way Carlos framed it. From my vantage point, we've come into a new time. We have expectations of people that they have to uphold, and when somebody crosses the line, not to say that they can't learn and grow. In fact, that's usually where I come at it from. But when somebody becomes entrenched and my way or the highway, that lack of empathy, I think, that's usually a pretty good sign for me that they might not be fitting where we're going anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to delve too far into the law, although I can talk about just cause, endlessly. But that's essentially what you're looking at. If you're looking at whether you can always let somebody go and give them severance. So if it's just not going to work out, it's not going to work out. But when you talk about just cause, it's really when the relationship is irreparable. So it's when you've had those discussions and they've given you very clear indications that they're not going to change. And that's from a legal perspective, that's when you'd be looking at it. So it's parallel or similar to what you're saying about when it's just clear they're not a fit and they're not willing to change or even to listen. So I want to shift gears. And as I said, the time flies by faster than we ever expected to. So I did want to talk a little bit about, sort of post-incident. So let's assume we've had an incident where someone either made an inappropriate joke that, got reported back to the organization, or maybe someone is engaging in a lack of civility, which is bordering on bullying, or whatever the case is. There's been a concern or a complaint raised. There's been an investigation, but at the end of the day, both people are still there in the organization. So how do you reset the relationship and the situation to move forward? I don't know, Shawnee, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I'll jump on that. So I actually think it starts as early as, the actual investigation itself. And even before that, the training in, how to raise complaints, how to get concerns addressed. Because for me, and I think I shared this once with you in the past, the idea of an investigation process is actually a healthy process for an organization. It is conflict resolution, maybe a more formal way, but it's the way that we have in organizations if the informal ways that we hopefully teach them don't work. And so when we have an investigation, I talk about when I do them, right? When I talk about with the people, I'm like, I realize this feels very stressful, and oftentimes people are losing sleep no matter which side of the investigation they're on. And I talk about, let's see where this goes. and treat it like a learning opportunity, that we're going to come out the other side with some new knowledge that we didn't have, hopefully some new skills to be learned. And organizationally as well, there's often structural types of contributors and power factors in play here that contribute to how we ended up. And so organizations can learn from these processes as well. I think that, and I talk about this, it's not a bad person, but they might have done a bad thing. And that if they've done a bad thing, they can learn from it. And I think that language, maybe not exactly how I've said it, someone more articulate, but that type of concept is really what I want to leave people with going through that process. So when we come out the other side, that they realize that there's a forward opportunity, that they're not just, branded for life.
I like that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, if I can add, I think that 100% everything Shawnee just said, and hopefully the organization has done that deep dive on their culture, given people the skill set. So when those incidents happen, that the post of it is that investigation, but also it already makes sense of what kind of next steps are going to be, because we set up the organization to deal with it. Like, this is what's going to happen. We just have to address the elephant in the room. If you cross the line, this is how it could play out. It can play out, in the worst ways. I remember when I first started a job, there's rules about intoxication on the workplace, what can be immediately fireable versus, 1 or 2 or 3 warnings before you're fired. Talk about it. And for some reason around inclusion stuff, DEI stuff, and I understand why it's very personal for people. We still want to kind of like that cartoon movie my daughter watched in Kanto. We don't talk about Bruno. Like, we just don't want to talk about it. We just kind of back away. We got to talk about it. These are going to be the steps. This is what's going to happen, investigation, and then post. This is what we're going to do for the two of you. But for us as an organization, in terms of how we address it, that's in a way that protects privacy and all those kind of things, but allows people to know that this is being dealt with. Because I think this is where people start to do all the quiet quitting or all the stuff that people are talking about, is when they see there's a lack of actual motivation for the organization to address it. Well, then I'm just going to, continue my behavior or just not speak up, because what are you guys going to do about it? So I think setting that up post any event happening gives you the ideas and the skill sets and the framework of how to deal with it post, to Shawnee's point, that investigation.
Thanks. And as people who know me know that I'm a huge Disney fan, so thanks for working at Disney reference it. Your comments, I appreciate that.
No problem.
Before I get to offer my rant, first of all, I want to thank both of you for coming. It was really great, and I appreciate the different perspectives both of you guys brought. And obviously, we could have gone on for a lot longer, but I really appreciate it. And like I said, I appreciate the fact that you both come at it from different perspectives. So thank you guys both for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thanks. And now I'll take my turn to fire away. So today I'm following up on the discussion that we had with Carlos and Shawnee in season 6, episode 1 of Fire Away, dealing with conflict in the workplace and things like microaggressions and the class clown and inappropriate jokes. And really my point today is that many organizations still don't know how to respond to complaints or suspicions of harassment or inappropriate behavior. And they tend to err at either one extreme or the other. In other words, they either ignore the issue completely and fail to investigate, or they just fire the accused, cancel culture, fire them right away without investigating. Neither of those is appropriate, and both of them can expose the organization to liability. And from what I've seen and from the comments I get from clients, a lot of times the organizations just assume that they don't have to investigate. So I'm going to review a couple of the common scenarios. One is where there's an anonymous complaint. Even though the ability to investigate an anonymous complaint may be limited, there is still a duty to investigate. The second is if there's no complaint at all. Maybe you've heard rumors or there's been an informal comment made, but there's no actual complaint. And I see too many companies latch onto that and say, well, there's no written complaint, so we're not going to deal with it. Occupational health and safety laws require that you investigate incidents of harassment, which can include a suspected incident, even if there is no complaint. You can't just bury your head in the sand and pretend you didn't hear about it. You need to investigate it. The other scenario that we hear often is where the complainant refuses to participate. So they file a complaint or they tell HR, but then they say, I don't want to be involved. Again, your ability to investigate may be limited, but you have to consider other sources of information, and you're going to have to go through an investigation. And then the other scenario, the complainant resigns or the accused resigns. And I can't tell you how many times I've received those celebratory phone calls or emails saying, great news. Remember the incident I told you about? Well, they resigned, so we can just close our file. And I get to be the bearer of bad news, of course, and say it's not that simple. And on the issue of, scenario where the complainant resigned, which happens, unfortunately, still happens fairly often. Remember that employers always have that duty to make all reasonable efforts to ensure a safe workplace. So just because someone who complained about being harassed has now left doesn't mean that you don't have to do anything further about that complaint. And imagine how a court's going to look at this. Imagine if the complainant resigns, you close your file, a few months later, somebody else complains that the same person was harassing them. And in the course of litigation, it comes out that you actually received a complaint about that person, but because the complainant resigned, you chose to do nothing about it. You're just increasing your potential liability. So again, you need to investigate even if one or both of the parties involved resigns. And I've talked a lot about investigations today, but I want to make one thing very clear. Investigations can take many forms. So it can be that massive undertaking that takes months with dozens or hundreds of witnesses and thousands of documents, and a huge report comes out at the end. Or it can be a couple of quick conversations and a really short closing email. So when I say you have to investigate, it doesn't mean the first example. It can be a very short investigation, but you need to investigate legitimately, objectively, and fairly before you close the file. That's your obligation. And if you don't, you're exposing yourself to substantial liability. And that's all for today. That's also a wrap for season 6, episode 1 of Fire Away. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining in. I want to thank Shawnee and Carlos for joining me for a great discussion. I want to remind everyone that past episodes can be found on YouTube, on our website, and archived on Facebook. And if you like our page or subscribe to our YouTube channel, you get notifications when episodes go live. Our next episode is going to be on March 21st. I'm going to be joined by Mark Keynes, who's the president and CEO of BlueLink, for a discussion on how to detect, handle, and ultimately prevent cybersecurity issues among employees. So tune in for that. Should be a great discussion. Lastly, I want to remind everyone that at Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. So I encourage you to keep up to date on employment law by following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and please check out our new TikTok feed as well, which I have been having some fun with lately. And lastly, subscribing to our newsletter you can get our monthly employment law updates. And finally, as we always say, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. If you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So feel free to reach out to us. Thanks to Rob, Rebecca, and Mark for helping put the show together. As always, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.